Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to chat about We Are Not Free by Traci Chee. This is a really moving and powerful book that follows a group of 14 Japanese American teenagers who are incarcerated in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. And for me as a writer, one of the most striking things that I noticed about it was the way that she uses all 14 of those characters as viewpoints within the book, usually maybe one chapter from each person's viewpoint. And so today I want to talk with you all about 4 ways that I think she makes this really work. So number 1, we'll start off with a bit of a simpler one here, which is that she gives each character a defining trait and repeatedly associates them with that trait. So for example, when readers hear the name Minnow, they think drawing. When they hear the name Betty, they think blonde wig. But these traits are not just superficial, they also reveal deeper things about the characters, their motivations, their desires, and how they are and move through the world. So for Betty, for example, that's her sort of internal conflict about feeling like she has to give up or move away from her Japanese identity, her Japanese-ness, and chase after this glamorous life of a movie star in a big American city. Or for Minnow, I think drawing is coupled with 2 different things. The first is on a larger social scale, basically literally drawing his community and his loved ones in all their complexities and restoring the humanity and nuance to them that racist American propaganda has been taking away. So, for example, Minnow sees this really racist ad that has a caricature of a Japanese American, Japanese person on it, and he thinks, I'm not a great artist or anything, but I'm a better artist than that. When I draw the people in my neighborhood, I draw them with eyes like crescent moons and kindness and red bean cakes split down the center. So here, drawing is not just depicting people realistically, but it's also restoring their humanity to them and bringing in that kindness and that care that the propaganda erases, and really seeing the atrocities that are being committed within Minnow's community in a way that mainstream white America doesn't see. And I think the second thing that drawing is connected to for Minnow is more internal, is more in terms of his own identity. He expresses his love for people by drawing them, and he uses this to push back against the bullying that he faces based on his identity. And this becomes a basis for a really touching scene with another character later in the book. And Chee starts to set this up from the very first chapter, the very first pages of the book. And so then throughout the book later, whenever readers see the name Minnow, they think drawing, and drawing, they think all of these other things. A boy who cares, a boy who loves other boys, a boy who sees his community. And so drawing becomes a shortcut to all of these things about Minnow. So when you're writing multi-POV books, I think the takeaway here is to give each character a shortcut like this, but make it something meaningful, not just superficial. So that is doing double duty, is not just reminding readers who each person is, but also capturing the characters' motivations and desires and who they are on a deeper personal level. The second thing that she does that I think makes this multi-POV really work well is that the characters start as a group, but then they start to diverge and take different paths later in the book. So at first, when the reader is sort of getting accustomed to the setting and learning about the historical circumstances, she doesn't overload you with too much information. So all of these characters sort of come together as a group. And even if you can't necessarily remember everyone's names or who everyone is, you understand as a group how they fit into society, what their place is, what their general role is. At this point early in the story, she starts to give you a few characters to latch onto. So the first one is Minnow, because his point of view chapter is first. And then through Minnow, once you get a sense of him, he starts to introduce you to a few other characters. So for example, Mas, his older brother, he's mentioned in the first line, I believe, of the book, and then again many times throughout the first chapter. And even though we don't get his point of view right away, he becomes a sort of foundation or a cornerstone in the group because he's so solid and dependable, and it's the same way within the reader's understanding of the group. I think it's also really important to note that in that first chapter, Minnow establishes this group of friends as an entity in itself. So he's constantly referring to, oh, the guys or our group. But at the same time, he's dropping people's names. And so readers, even subconsciously, start to get a sense of who's around, who's involved in this group. Later in the book, though, once readers have gotten familiar with the characters and their circumstances, their temperaments and personalities, they start to make choices that split them apart, that make their paths take different directions. And I think the reader actually feels this as something to be mourned, which is a feeling that's reflected by a lot of the characters in the book. But at the same time, I think it is necessary, because if this group had stayed together throughout the whole story, readers would be left sort of feeling like, oh, well, why did we have to have all 14 of these points of view if essentially the group is following the same trajectory, all the members are going the same place throughout the book. So within the context of this story, it was necessary to split them apart and distinguish their paths, as Chee does. But on the other hand, I think in this case, the group identity is a really important part of each character's identity and their circumstances, and Chee doesn't let go of that even as the characters' paths start to diverge. So one way that she does that is by going into a collective narration in one chapter of the book, which is just titled All of Us. So it's told from the point of view of all of these characters. It uses the collective we, the first person plural. And this chapter comes when a really, really devastating event happens, something that shakes the group to its very core and takes away something that's vital to them. And it's at that moment, of course, that it's most important for them to remember that they are a family. So, as I mentioned, there's no singular I in this chapter. Unlike all of the other chapters, it's things like we hear the news, but we don't believe it at first. And the title of the chapter is We Hold Our Breath. It's not We Hold Our Breaths. So it's emphasizing this collective identity of the many as the one. And then finally, another important thing I think Chee does in this regard of not letting go of this sort of collective group identity is that she brings us back to Minnow's point of view in the very last chapter. And so readers feel like we've come full circle. We're reminded of where we came from when this group was one whole entity. But we also see what's changed over the course of the years of the book and the events that have sort of pulled the group apart and really fractured it in some very fundamental ways. So as a writer, I think it's really enlightening to look at how Chee builds up these characters individually, but also as part of the group and never letting go of that group identity, which is so important to who these characters are as people. Now, the third thing that she does is that she builds up each character through the other character's eyes, and so readers are already familiar with them before we get to their own viewpoint chapter. So Minnow is the starting point for all of this. We start with his point of view, and then in his chapter we start to get to know some of the others, as I mentioned. But I think now that we've talked about this group dynamic or group identity, I think it's especially interesting to notice how Minnow's chapter builds up these individual characters while also making it really clear that they're firmly a part of the group. So let's look at some examples here. Some of the guys, like Shig's best buddy, Twitchy Hashimoto, you can't help but pay attention to. Twitchy's the best looking guy in our group. So in this example, you get a bit about Twitchy, but it's very much grounded in his position within this group. He's the best looking guy in the group, so you never forget about this group identity. And similarly, Shig's not as handsome as Twitchy or Moss, but I think he's the most well-liked fella in our group. So by assigning these superlatives to different people, Minnow's perspective starts to help readers get a sense of who they are, how they interact with each other, what their roles are within the group, but never letting us forget that they are a part of this collective identity. But it's not just in this first chapter when we're getting to know people that characters are introduced through each other's eyes and through each other's viewpoints. It happened throughout the book. So, for example, a lot of the other characters call Mary the angry one. And so we have this sense of her sort of personality before we get to her viewpoint chapter. But then when we get there, we finally understand deeply why she's the angry one or the sullen one. And we're ready to find that out because we've been reminded so many times through so many different characters' perspectives that she is this sort of archetype, this trope within the group. And I think this repetition or these subtle variations on different characters' interpretations of each other are really important for helping readers build up a foundational understanding of who the characters are before we get to their POV chapters. And so we don't feel like we have to start fresh with every single chapter, but rather we're ready to just jump right in with the knowledge that we already have about these characters, that we've already gleaned from the other characters' perspectives. And that, I think, makes for a much smoother reading experience. Then finally, I think one really important strategy that she uses is that she establishes really different narrative voices and styles for each character. This is an interesting one because I think on the one hand, the more POVs you have, the more you have to distinguish them from each other so that readers can tell them apart. But the more you distinguish them, the more risk you run, I think, of making it feel unrealistic or going too far, almost like, do people actually talk or think that differently? But in this case, I think the pretty dramatic differences between the styles and narrative voices in the chapters works well, and I think it's for a few reasons. The first one is simple. They're teens, and that's the point in your life when you're trying on different identities, facades, is not necessarily going to be natural per se. I think the second reason why this works is related to what we were talking about earlier with the sort of defining trait or characteristic or thing that each character has. I think the narrative voice is almost an extension of that. It could seem almost simplistic on the surface, but she doesn't just stop at the surface level. She uses it as a symbol or a manifestation of a lot of things that are going on deeper in the characters' motivations or psyches, and she delves into that throughout their chapters. And so even if you have these pretty defined surface level differences between characters, she looks into the complexities and nuances that make them who they are beyond just this thing, this voice that they have. And I think having these complexities is really crucial if you're going to be distinguishing your characters by pretty broad shifts in the narrative voice. So one thing I found really striking was how quickly Chee manages to indicate the differences in the characters' voices within the chapters. It's often within the first sentence or definitely within the first page. So let's look at a few examples here. So Betty, the blonde wig one again, and all of these quotes are going to come from the first page of these characters' chapters. So Betty says, "As for me, I am looking forward to another adventure, particularly aboard a train. Although I must confess I'm a tad disappointed with the rail cars that screech to a stop next to the town Ferran fence." So you can see that her tone is formal. It's almost pretentious. It's a little old-fashioned, and that ties back to this romanticization of the movie star life that we talked about and everything that implies relating to her own Japanese identity. Then on the other hand, you have a character like Frankie. "Me and Stan Katsumoto are hanging around by I-9E, so-called City Hall, when the army jeep comes roaring toward camp, and I'm not gonna lie, the sight of the tires kicking up a dust cloud in the cold January morning makes me want to hit something." So you can see this is much more casual. It's not perfectly grammatically correct. He uses gonna and wanna. So it's really, really different just at first blush from Betty's narrative voice. And then of course there are a lot of different variations on this and different subtleties that she uses to distinguish the characters. And then even beyond that, she uses a lot of different formats. So for example, Maz's chapter is told in diary entries, and a lot of those are letters to his father. Keiko's chapter is told in little snapshots of time that are all counting down to the time when a certain character leaves. Tommy's chapter is a series of poems, so you can see that all of these different formats and voices are pretty distinct from each other and immediately let the reader know, oh, this is a different person whose voice we're hearing. Again, I think it is really crucial to be careful of making sure you're not erasing or flattening out the complexities of characters by reducing them to stereotypes of their voice or form, or even making it feel like you're going overboard trying too hard to distinguish characters in a very artificial way. But if you can tie everything back to these more internal complexities of the characters, I think Chee's strategy that she uses to really quickly distinguish these voices and viewpoints can be really helpful in quickly reorienting readers from one chapter to another, one character to another. So I think these four things, giving characters trademarks or shortcuts, starting as a group before diverging, building up characters through each other's eyes, and giving characters their own very distinct voices, I think those four things all really help to make the 14 POVs in We Are Not Free really effective. And as I've been thinking about this, I've realized that it's not only effective and necessary from the standpoint of narrative or writing craft, but also in debunking this myth that all Asians or all Asian Americans are the same, the sort of the myth of the Asian monolith. So I guess that's where I'm really landing with this, is that Chee's work is not only a great example from a craft perspective, but also she uses this strategy to really support some of the thematic elements of her work as well. So if you've read this book, I would love to hear what you thought, whether writing related or otherwise. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to get notified when I post another video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.